So, for everyone that actually knows me, good morning. I hope you're well. Um, but everyone that's actually really deeply in my life knows that most of my free time is spent in the areas of macroeconomics and geopolitics. And this is driven by real care and concern for what my overall views are on current human condition. So, with that being said, the Ukrainian engagement to me seems to be reaching a crescendo. So, this is something I couldn't ignore any longer. I had to take the time to put something together. So, from what I've paid attention to and what I've been able to see over these last, I don't know, I've been paying attention to Ukraine very closely, almost daily, for probably 3 or 3.5 years. I probably have 5 or 6 or 7 hours of public talks on the subject already with various peers that I respect in the space. But with all that being said, this is my most recent Ukraine piece. It's titled Ashes Over Kiev: How the West Stays Alive by Stealing Futures. Chapter 1, The Crescendo and the Curtain. History does not repeat, but its rhythms do. The war in Ukraine is not a single event, it is a crescendo in a centuries old composition, the death symphony of a collapsing imperial order. What we are witnessing is not merely a geopolitical dispute, nor a spontaneous outbreak of war. It's the West's third attempt in 100 years to break apart Russia and privatize its ashes. It is also the clearest signal yet that the orchestrators of this world have run out of notes. In the West, where media speaks in slogans and memory spans mere moments, it is still taboo to say this war was provoked, that it was planned, that it was needed, not by the people of Ukraine or Russia, but by the decaying financial organisms that rule Washington, Brussels, and the square mile. These organisms, they do not govern, they feed. Their survival requires collapse, dismemberment, and fire sales of state assets disguised as humanitarian intervention. They've done it before in Iraq, in Libya, in Yugoslavia. In 1991, they did it to Russia herself. This time, the target was larger, more dangerous, not just a nation, but a civilization with the capacity to say no. What followed was not a failure of diplomacy, it was the culmination of a plan, and we will show you. It begins with maps, budgets, with shifting pipeline routes and press releases from USAID, with photo ops and sudden regime changes, with Hunter Biden's cracked out face next to Burisma logos, with color revolutions rehearsed like theater, with biolabs and the ghost money of Congress, with NATO declarations in Bucharest, with the frozen grin of Victoria Nuland and the incestuous think tank her husband runs. This war has fingerprints all over it, if you know what ink they print in. To understand what's happening in Ukraine, one must understand the strategy of encirclement that began after the Cold War, a deliberate expansion of NATO into the East despite every promise not to. In 2004 and 2014, color revolutions, trained and funded by the US and EU organizations under the guise of democracy promotion. The erasure of historical memory and the resurrection of Nazi aligned factions in Ukraine as national heroes, supported both by Zionist oligarchs and American NGOs. The looting of Ukraine's industries and land by Western financial institutions from Monsanto to BlackRock and the dark derivative system they need to feed. This is not a story of good and evil, it is a story of theft. Theft of nations, theft of memory, and theft of futures. We call this chapter Ashes Over Kiev, not because it is the beginning of the end, but because it is the point where the smoke makes the outlines visible. This is where we name names. This is where we set the frame. This is where we stop pretending it was ever about Ukraine. Let the ash fall. Let the curtain rise. Let the investigation begin. Chapter 2 is the color of money. Before a single missile was launched, before the first trench was dug, the war had already begun on balance sheets and bond markets, in back rooms and boardrooms, in the shadowy slipstream where capital moves faster than conscience. What most people miss is that wars of this scale are never launched for territory. They are launched with territory as cover for something much deeper. Ukraine is not just a battlefield. It is a balance sheet. It's a conduit, a proxy asset in the forever war between emergent multipolar resistance and the degenerating empire of debt. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Western financial planners flooded into Russia and the Ukraine. Names like Jeffrey Sachs and Larry Summers became famous or infamous for prescribing shock therapy, a euphemism for ripping open national economies and handing their organs to Western banks. By 1994, life expectancy in Russia plummeted. Alcoholism skyrocketed. Suicides and organized crime exploded. A Harvard-run USAID project in Russia, led by Andrei Schleifer and funded by taxpayer dollars, was later found to be funneling millions to enrich its own consultants while privatizing entire sectors. And you see this activity across the board. This wasn't mismanagement, it was method. Ukraine was no different. By the early 2000s, its energy grid, mineral rights, and farmland were in play. Monsanto, Cargill, and DuPont snapped up millions of acres. The EU and IMF demanded reforms, which always meant stripping social supports and selling public assets. The 2004 Orange Revolution was praised as a democratic awakening, but it was funded by the U.S. State Department, George Soros' Open Society Foundation, and the National Endowment for Democracy. It was color-coded regime change, a well-rehearsed script used in Serbia, Georgia, and elsewhere. When Viktor Yanukovych leaned back toward Russia in 2013, the script kicked back in. A second regime change followed. The U.S. admitted to spending over $5 billion on Ukrainian democracy promotion. Nuland's infamous call of "fuck the Europeans" revealed how little of it was ever about Ukrainians. Meanwhile, Hunter Biden joined the board of Burisma, a gas company under investigation. BlackRock began advising Ukraine's central bank. McKinsey showed up. The World Bank offered restructuring. Each layer of bureaucracy masked another transfer of wealth and sovereignty. This wasn't just war preparation. This was the war. A preemptive decapitation of Ukraine's ability to act as a sovereign bridge between East and West. It was turned into a hollowed-out corridor for capital extraction and weapons laundering. So when the bombs finally fell, the groundwork had already been laid. Chapter 3 is the ghosts of 1991. To understand 2022, we must go back to 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, the last geopolitical counterweight to Western finance capitalism. This wasn't a spontaneous collapse. It was engineered, or at the very least, eagerly awaited by those who had already mapped the carcass. In the aftermath, American economists, hedge funds, and intelligence-linked NGOs descended on Russia like carrion birds. The liberalization plan, written in Washington, rubber-stamped in Brussels, turned Russian state assets into commodities overnight. Oil fields, aluminum mines, the railroads, entire cities were just given away. Oligarchs were not a Russian invention. They were a Western installation. The shock therapy imposed by the Harvard boys and IMF technocrats didn't fail. It succeeded in its true mission: to break Russia so thoroughly it could never again rise as rival, and for a time it worked. Life expectancy collapsed, birth rates plummeted, the military fractured, the ruble tanked, children froze in unheated hospitals. Sex trafficking exploded. Russian scientists were found washing dishes in Tel Aviv. It was the greatest peacetime theft in modern history, and still it was not enough. The West's endgame wasn't just to loot Russia, it was to erase its civilizational memory, its cultural continuity, its Orthodox faith, its literary soul, its Slavic pride. Everything had made it a pole of identity outside Western liberalism was targeted. The rise of Vladimir Putin was not a fluke, it was a backlash. Putin understood something that terrified Washington. The only way to stop being a colony was to stop acting like one. He began to re-centralize power, reassert control over oligarchs, restore the military, and rebuild the church. In 2007, the Munich speech made it very explicit. Russia would no longer accept a unipolar world. From that moment forward, Russia was marked again for containment, dismemberment, and recolonization. Not because of what it did, but because of what it remembered. That's why Ukraine was always the key. If you want to kill a civilization, you must cut out its heart, and Kyiv is where it beats. Chapter 4 is the encirclement doctrine. The Cold War was declared over in 1991, but someone forgot to tell NATO. Despite explicit assurances to Soviet leaders that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, the Western military bloc added 15 new member states in the decades that followed, creeping ever closer to Russia's borders. From the Baltic to the Balkans, each ascension was another dagger pointed at the heart of Moscow. Why? Because NATO was never just a defensive alliance. It is a military enforcement wing of Western capital, protecting trade routes, energy contracts, and ideological dominance. The expansion wasn't about safety, it was about containment. Containment of Russia, containment of China, containment of any nation that might chart an independent path outside the Washington consensus. Ukraine was the crown jewel in this containment project, a massive land bridge between Europe and Eurasia with a deeply intertwined history with Russia. It was a red line, and NATO knew that it was a red line. That's why they crossed it. In 2008, the Bucharest summit declared Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members. No timeline, no process, just a vague promise, one that guaranteed permanent instability. Russia responded with alarm. The West pretended to be surprised. Then came the think tanks, the war games, the pipeline plans, the defensive weapons shipments, all of it dressed in the language of freedom, democracy, and Euro-Atlantic values, whatever that means. But in truth, it was a siege, a modern-day cordon sanitaire designed to choke Russia's influence, split Eurasia, and keep the dollar system supreme. When Ukraine refused to play along in 2013, the Maidan was lit, and the final act of encirclement began. Chapter 5 is the Maidan Mirage. The Maidan uprising of 2014 is sold in the West as a people's revolution, the triumph of democracy over corruption. But behind the crowds and camera crews was something far more engineered. It began when President Viktor Yanukovych, under immense pressure from both East and West, chose to delay an EU association agreement in favor of closer ties with Russia. That was all it took. The crowds were mobilized, the NGOs were activated, and the American diplomats flew in quite literally with cookies. Victoria Nuland, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, was caught on tape selecting Ukraine's post-coup leadership like casting a play. Yats is the guy, she said, of Arseny Yatsenyuk. And so he was. John McCain appeared on the Maidan stage, flanked by far-right nationalists shouting about freedom. No one seemed to notice that among their coalition were open neo-Nazis, the followers of Stepan Bandera, a World War II-era Ukrainian fascist who collaborated with the Nazis and murdered Poles, Jews, and Russians alike. These weren't fringe elements. They were armed, organized, and crucial to the coup's success. After the smoke cleared, Yanukovych fled. A new government, Western-aligned and IMF-compliant, was installed, and Ukraine's east erupted in protest. The Donbass, heavily Russian-speaking and economically linked to Russia, refused to recognize the coup. Crimea, fearing ethnic cleansing and NATO expansion, voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia. What followed was civil war, though in truth it was never civil. The U.S. poured in billions of dollars in aid, weapons, and training. Ukrainian oligarchs funded private militias. The Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi unit with the Volsignal insignias, was integrated into the National Guard. Western media sanitized it all. The narrative was set. Ukraine was a victim. Russia was the aggressor. Anyone who questioned the coup was a Putin apologist. But Maidan was not a revolution. It was a regime change operation, a color revolution in broad daylight, and Ukraine was never its true beneficiary. It was the patient. The anesthetic was freedom. The surgeons came to harvest the organs. Chapter 6 is Burisma Biolabs and Biden's smite. After the Maidan coup, Ukraine was open for business, and the West wasted no time. Enter Burisma. A shady natural gas company with ties to Ukraine's post-coup elite, Burisma appointed Hunter Biden, a man with no experience in energy or Ukraine, to its board. His salary was up to $183,000 a month. This wasn't just nepotism, it was a message. Joe Biden, then Vice President of the United States, had made the point man, who had been made the point man for Ukraine, and his son was now a sitting board member of the very kleptocracy Washington claimed to be reforming. When a Ukrainian prosecutor began investigating Burisma, Biden publicly demanded his firing, bragging about it on camera. "I said, you're not going to get the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. I said, call Obama," and the guy got fired. The media called it debunked conspiracy, but the video speaks for itself. And Burisma was just the tip of the iceberg. Under the pretext of health security, the U.S. funded over 30 biological laboratories in Ukraine. The Department of Defense's Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the official story, old Soviet pathogens needed containment. The unofficial experimental research in proximity to Russia. When the war began in 2022, Russia accused the U.S. of operating secret biolabs in violation of international treaties. U.S. officials at first denied the labs existed, then admitted they did, but claimed they were harmless. How is Russia supposed to know that? Documents later released from Hunter Biden's abandoned laptop show his investment firm had financed Meta Biota, a company working with those very labs. Burisma, Biolabs, Biden's. This wasn't corruption as usual. It was a mindset. The IMF groomed rentier state turned profit farm for Western elites. It was a broken country on purpose, a bought government, and a family business. And when the profits dried up, there was always war, the most lucrative contract of all. Chapter 7 is the Black Hand and Black Rock. In Mafia lore, a black hand meant a warning. In Ukraine, it meant a welcome mat for BlackRock. The world's largest asset manager didn't arrive after the dust settled. It helped design the war's aftermath before the war even ended. In 2022, Ukraine's Ministry of Economy signed a memorandum of understanding with BlackRock's Financial Markets Advisory Division. Their goal? To advise on a roadmap for investment, code for post-war privatization. What would this roadmap entail? The sale of state-owned enterprises, hundreds of them, from infrastructure to agriculture. The leasing of farmland to foreign investors, with Monsanto, Cargill, and DuPont already in position. This transformation of nation into a yield-bearing instrument insured by Western taxpayers and secured by the blood of Ukrainians. This wasn't opportunism, it was premeditated policy. Back in 2014, USAID, World Bank, and IMF had already begun restructuring Ukraine's economy, slashing subsidies, raising utility prices, and pushing privatization under the guise of reform. Now, with the war's cover, the process could be fast-tracked, and BlackRock wasn't alone. McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group were brought in to design the reconstruction blueprint. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and other financial behemoths were eyeing investment opportunities. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Georgia, joined Ukraine's Defense Tech Initiative. The Western financial class, whose own economies teetered on debt and dysfunction, founded Ukraine a fresh host. Like vultures circling a mortally wounded deer, they offered medicine that only accelerated the bleed. Ukraine was never meant to win. It was meant to be bled just long enough to justify its dismantling, and then sold off into pieces. The war wasn't the end, it was the fire sale. What the West calls rebuilding is just another word for owning. Chapter 8 is Digital Gulag in the new Panopticon. As Ukraine burned, something quieter but no less dystopian was being installed, a new kind of governance powered by apps and algorithms. While tanks rolled and buildings crumbled, Western advisors and Silicon Valley emissaries were wiring Ukraine into the next phase of the digital experiment, one designed not to heal but to bind. At the center of it all was Dia, Ukraine's digital state in a smartphone, celebrated by the World Economic Forum and USAID alike. On the surface, it was sleek and convenient, a platform to access ID, pay taxes, and manage documents. But underneath, it was centralized biometric data. It merged surveillance with compliance. It created the architecture for programmable citizenship, the kind that can be revoked with a swipe. The West lauded Ukraine as a testing ground for digital governance. In reality, it became a petri dish for social control. While bombs fell, data was harvested. While soldiers died, futures were uploaded and monetized. But Dia was just the start. Palantir provided battlefield intelligence systems and stayed for post-war analytics. Whitney Webb does really great work in this regard. Clearview AI, infamous for its facial recognition software, made its way into Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. The e-residency model, pioneered in Estonia, was eyed for mass export, reducing citizenship to a login credential. This wasn't liberation, it was infrastructure for compliance. The ultimate goal, a population trained to behave, rewarded with access and punished with exclusion. A citizenship tied not to birth or nation, but to digital obedience. Ukraine wasn't just a war zone, it was a proving ground, a place to refine the tools that will soon be exported to every corner of the planet Earth. In the name of freedom, the cage was made beautiful. Chapter 9, The Black Hand in BlackRock. In the smoke and rubble of eastern Ukraine, when it became clear the war could not be short nor clean, A different kind of army moved in, not soldiers, not peacekeepers, investment bankers. By mid 2022, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, was already crafting Ukraine's reconstruction plan. Larry Fink met directly with President Zelensky and promised the Western elite would help rebuild Ukraine as a beacon of democracy, whatever that means. What they meant was, we will carve you into bonds. Behind the scenes, BlackRock assembled a working group to coordinate investment into Ukraine's energy, agriculture, and infrastructure sectors. This wasn't philanthropy, it was a liquidation plan. State assets, mines, utilities, ports were to be bundled and sold to the highest bidder. Pension funds, desperate for yield, were to be enticed with promise of post-war growth. Insurance mechanisms backed by Western governments would shield investors from risk, ensuring profits even if the war dragged on. In short, BlackRock would securitize the assets. They were joined by J.P. Morgan, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and all the usual suspects. They called it a public-private partnership, but it was the same black hand that had asset-stripped Greece, that had crushed Puerto Rico, that had looted post-apartheid South Africa through currency arbitrage and vulture funds. In Ukraine, it found a perfect storm, a nation desperate for survival, a political elite willing to sell, a media ecosystem too distracted to ask questions. What followed was financial necromancy, the resurrection of a broken country not for its people but for portfolios. Ukraine, like Iraq before it, became a sandbox for empire finance. Not only were lives mortgaged, so were futures. The fertile soil of Ukraine, its gas pipelines, its railways, its lithium, all turned into derivatives, promises, tokens of trade on a dying Western spreadsheet. This is not reconstruction. This is the final phase of war. Not with missiles, but with ledgers. The West no longer conquers to rule, it conquers to foreclose. And BlackRock is the repo man. This is the conclusion, a funeral for the future. There will be no victory parade, no confetti in the streets, no ticker tape rain, no jubilant faces on television. Just silence, just smog. Just the lingering hum of drones above cities that do not know who they serve anymore. Because this was never a war meant to be won. It was a harvest, a ritual liquidation, a performance of sovereignty, a shell game played by fading empires desperate to maintain the illusion of life. And in that performance, futures were stolen. The future of Ukraine auctioned to bankers, the future of Russia encircled by false promises and slow betrayal, the future of Europe shackled to American energy and military occupation under the guise of security, the future of the global South watching as once again the rules-based international order changed its rules mid-game, the future of the United States itself, draining its last moral reserves to feed the hunger of its corporate war engine. And yet, the lie is louder than the requiem. Zelensky still smiles from Vogue spreads and weapons deals. Think tanks still publish essays on strategic ambiguity. Senators still make speeches about democracy while holding private equity portfolios that bet on blood. But underneath it all, the empire is rotting. Ukraine did not mark a return to unipolar power. It marked its fossilization. What we have witnessed was not the expansion of Western ideals. It was the metastasis of a system that cannot exist without crisis. It exports war, not freedom. It exports debt, not aid. It feeds on the future, yours, mine's, and everyone's. And now it feeds on itself. So let this be a funeral for the future they imagine, not our future, theirs. the one where finance conquers meaning, where surveillance replaces spirit, where history ends and only branding remains. We reject it. We mourn the dead. We name the crimes, and we light the flame. Let this be the last time the world mistakes silence for consent. Let the real music begin.